we're I can't let you get away because you just planted the seed with it. When we're getting into highlights of the Swanson murders and such, and Lieutenant Hannell beforehand, he had done a little bit of pre-event planning here and had found another podcast, and then independently you had talked about finding a podcast that talked about the Swanson murders that were unsolved for a great amount of time before you were able to. So maybe, but for the people listening, I think they're going to love to hear this. Can we go through the beginning of that and tell us about, from the beginning when the incident occurred, and we'll pick it apart as it goes. But I'm excited to hear this. So.
Okay. Well, as I said, I was in investigations just prior to the Swanson Motel murders. Chief Gary Banyai at that time was on patrol on the morning that it happened. He picked me up, and I really believe it was a Sunday night, and it was a Monday morning when we got picked up, and after I'd taken him home, I had just got into the police department, and we get this call, and dispatch said, "There's a lady. We just received a call. A gentleman was at the Swanson Motel. There's a lady tied up on the floor, and he thought she was dead." Of course, we go racing over there, and so I didn't go in. I was on the outside. I was the rookie, so I stayed out. I was the young one, so I stayed out and protected the crime scene from the outside. Officers went in, determined that she was dead, and we called investigators. And at that time, it was Jim Rice was the investigator. Now, we hadn't experienced it for the city, and especially the police department, hadn't dealt with a homicide before. And so I was just saying to myself, I am so thankful I'm not in investigations, because I wouldn't know where to begin with this thing. And with that, troops were called in, and the coroner was called in. Little bit later, as the investigation progressed, within about a half hour, a car screams up to it, just in time for school to start. And out this woman comes racing out of the car, and I had to hold her back. I remember that. And she was my baby. And nobody could figure out what the heck she was talking about. At that time, one of the investigators went back into the back bedroom, lifted the covers off the bed, and found Danelle Lietz, the 7-year-old girl. So we didn't know she was back there. We knew the grandma, and we were focusing on grandma, on Priscilla. And so they found out that she was also killed.
Where are these motels located at that time, for the listeners watching?
Swanson Motel is on the corner of Villard, and 8th Avenue West. Okay. I think it's Honda dealer right across the street now.
Yeah, it's about.
Okay, so it's a vacant lot right now. Okay. They tore it down. And the Swanson Motel was it had apartments for oil workers. The house across the street was also rented out. So there were a lot of people that stayed there for months at a time.
You guys were familiar with it?
Oh, we're familiar with it, yeah. So so the investigation continued. We had a lot of leads. Investigators were looking for suspects, and just nothing was panning out. We were chasing down a person that was walking down 22, and nobody knew him, and it was in the middle of the night, and so they were chasing that lead down. They finally caught up to him somewhere in South Dakota, I believe it was. So he didn't turn out. So where do you go from here? And so the Crime Bureau was called in to assist, and Norbert Sickler was assigned here, and so it was him and Jim Rice that kind of led the investigation. I remember a little bit later, about 2 hours later, 3 hours later, other BCI agents from Minot showed up, and
this was on the day of the incident.
Mm-hmm. And they showed up on the scene, and later, after it was solved, and we found out who it was, one of those investigators, one of those BCI agents said, "I was staring at him. He was watching from across the street." And I thought to myself, that's a suspect right there. But he never said anything. So, but
what's our manner of death on our victims?
Okay. Priscilla, the grandma, was on the living room floor. She had on a blue, what was later called a muumuu.
Okay.
A muumuu. She was tied up hog style. She was laying on her stomach, and so she had the rope wrapped around her neck. She had her hands tied behind her and her legs tied up. So they're all tied behind her. And if she struggled, she would strangle herself.
It seemed pretty sophisticated.
It did. That's what we thought right away. And so that was that case. Now, Danelle was wearing a strawberry shortcake nightgown, and she had a mark on her cheek that everybody thought was a bite mark, because it kind of looked like a bite mark. But it actually was him hitting her with a stick. Now, there was a table that folded down, and when the leaves were up, these sticks would hold those leaves up. And he got a hold of them, and after he had tied up Priscilla, the grandma, the little girl comes out and said, "What are you doing to grandma?" And he says to her, "Don't worry about it, go back to bed." And as he's escorting her back to bed, he picks up that stick and he smacks her. He hits her in the head.
And we're going to come back around. How do you get to that point of that information, right?
Oh, yeah. So he smacks her in the head with the other stick. He then proceeds to rape her vaginally and anally. He raped her, and then he felt so guilty about that, he covered her up. So he covered her up with blankets. That's why we couldn't find her right away. So the investigation continued. So grandma's strangled, so was the little girl. That's the cause of death.
Are you a father at this time?
In fact, my son was a classmate of Danelle at the Roosevelt School. Yeah, I am. And so we really needed to catch this guy. And there was every effort, I'll tell you. From there, the investigation, they did all the evidence. They did all. Now, DNA is that there isn't. It's just starting. I mean, they're just talking about DNA now, so they're not really doing anything. The crime lab comes out, collects all the evidence. That they did it professionally. They did like CSI. They came out. They did their own thing. From there, it just was a matter of interviewing people and doing all that kind of thing. A lot of people were interviewed. We interviewed all the residents, and nobody heard anything. One guy whose room was adjacent to the bedroom where the little girl was, thought he heard a cat meowing, and it probably was her. We don't know. That we're not sure with, because we do know that because he had tied her up, that she was alive when he raped her. So, yeah, and then he untied her, and she had died by then. So,
at what point does this thing for the department go cold, and we're at a stalemate of sorts?
It's hard to say it went cold because every investigator was in on it, but by the time Jackie got it, which was probably a couple years after that, we stayed on it for a long time. Back then, we didn't have the computer system, any of the stuff that you guys have now, technology you have now. And I remember Jim Rice sending fingerprints off to different agencies by mail, we had one fingerprint, and we were trying to nail it down.
Where'd you get the fingerprint from?
From a door jamb. And they had, and Aaron Rash was the head of the crime unit crime lab, and he had cut that, they cut it out like they did, taped it, and we just could not find the owner of that fingerprint, which was kind of interesting.
Yeah, was it on an interior door?
Interior, yep. And it would have been possibly the suspects because of the location of the jam door, or on the jam. So, now I need to tell you that when all the evidence nothing was brought to the crime scene by the suspect. This was all things that were inside the apartment, inside that office area, like the vacuum cleaner cord that he used to tie Grandma up with, and the sticks, of course. All these things were all within, and that's important, especially when I get to the profile part. So, so the case, they're still doing, tracking down suspects and all that kind of thing, and the cabinet that all this information is being stored in is about a 4 foot by or 3 foot high by 4 foot wide, 2 drawer, and metal cabinet that's in the detective's office. And so, of course, there's other things happening. And so as it goes along, like I say, about 2 years later, it becomes not so much a priority anymore. But whenever an investigator was assigned to the detectives division, they were assigned that case. And they were given a chance, fresh eyes are given a chance to look.
For sure.
Yep.
Which is a huge thing, yeah.
And Jackie went one step further. She contacted the FBI, and at that time, a brand new unit called the Profiling Unit, and it was really new. Profiling Unit was at the FBI, and so she asked for a profile, and John Douglas himself did the profiling. The John Douglas, yeah. So he did the profile, and she read it, or I don't know what, at that time, unlike the other podcasts, it wasn't that we were not for, we didn't want new techniques, and this was certainly new to us. It was us, a profile of a suspect. I think it was just we didn't know how to read it. They didn't know how to read it.
Because your take, you said on that other pod, there were some things that weren't completely, you felt accurate about it.
Yeah.
What were a couple of those?
Of that podcast?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, some of it is minor. It's like they that we didn't want to read the profile and use that. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that at all, and that's how it came out on that other podcast. Mm-hmm. And
that's big, yeah.
Yeah, and it's not that we didn't want it. I just think they didn't know how. Now, so the profile was done, more suspects, and were interviewed. They traveled all over, and Jackie did a lot of work on it. After that, I think my brother Arnie even looked at it, and for a while was looking at it. But
is he a DPD employee at that time?
Yeah, he's with the Dickinson Police Department, and he's an investigator. He did a lot of juvenile things, but I'm sure he looked at this thing too, because every new investigator got it. So Chief Bazzano rides into town as the new chief and gets a hold of me and says, "Okay, you're in investigations. I want," and he said, "I want you to kind of prioritize this. Not do your other things, but I want you to prioritize this, and I want you to look at it." And I said, "Okay." So I get this drawer, this cabinet, this metal cabinet. I can barely open it because the paperwork's falling out. I mean, it is just chock full of all kinds of things.
Are you guys at this time still downtown, or have you relocated?
No, we're at the LEC now.
Okay.
We're at the LEC, and so I start tearing it apart. I inherited 90-some suspects that they had named. I mean, they had sheets of paper listed as some serial killers. And in Texas and all over. So I thought, I'm going to start from ground zero. I read through the case, I read all the things, and I come across the profile. And I look at the profile, and I'll never forget this. Now, this is just a few months into it. I'm sitting at my kitchen table and at home, and I got this thing all sprawled out. And I look at the profile, and I jump up and I said, "I know who did it. I know who did this." And my wife at the time just looked at me and went, "What the heck?" And I said, "I know who did this. Now we got to find him." And the profile fit my guy really well. And so what I did is I did some more investigation into him while he lived here. And things like, I talked to his ex-wife. Actually, she wasn't an ex-wife. She was his current wife. He had a wife and 2 kids with her, and he had an ex-wife with 2 other kids. So this one particularly had 2 daughters. And I went to speak to her, and I asked her a couple of things. I said, after that happened, did Bill change his looks at all? And she said, yeah, because on the profile, it said that he would change his looks. I said, did he change his look? And she said, well, he had pitch black hair. Once this happened, his hair turned completely white. And I thought, wow. I said, how long did he stick around? She thought maybe a month after it happened. That was part of the profile.
What about so what gets me interested when you say that about what hit you, can you remember what you read that sparked it? What piece of information sparked it for you?
It wasn't one piece. It was several. It was several. And the whole profile, and I don't know why I could read it and say, okay, I can put a face to this thing, but I could, gift, whatever,
Yeah.
But I was able to say, this is the guy right here.
Okay.
So now we got to track him down. Sandy Greff, who was in charge of, at that time, she was forever with the police department, but she was in charge of records. I told her I would like to find him. And so we used, she went on and used the FBI again, NCIC. Every time they made a stop and ran an NCIC, excuse me, they recorded, the FBI recorded it. Well, we found out that a trooper down in Arkansas stopped him and ran an NCIC. And so that's how we found him. And Jerry Thyssen, BCI, contacted those guys. And we traveled down there because they said he was down there. And he was kind of wanted for a homicide down there as well in Batesville, Arkansas.
So from the time, what's the timeline from you get this in front of you or you're asked of this, to do this, working through that information? What kind of timeline are we talking about?
I would say about 6 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did it pretty much consume you?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I went to, yes, yeah. There were a lot of sleepless nights where I would just dwell in my brain and just go, okay, can I, is this the guy? Is this not the guy? I really just, like I said, I started from ground zero and went, okay, it's hard to comprehend that somebody close to you could actually do this. And it was hard for me. And once I got over that, then it was easier. It got easier because I think that's what was the roadblock was the fact that, how could somebody that's close do this to this little girl, But I got over that real quick. Now, later I learned that, he not only babysat for her, but he would give her baths and things like that. So this guy was so close to the family. And so about 6 months, and Sandy, I'll never forget Sandy, when she found him or found about where he was, she comes running into my office and says, I got him. I went, okay. So we went on from there. We drove down to, Jerry Thyssen and I drove down to Arkansas. And on the way down, we're talking strategic, what are we going to do? And I said, and I remember telling him, I'm not leaving until I find out one way or the other if he did it, because I really think he did. Well, Jerry was involved with it for a while, but I had taken it over. So he said, well, you do what you got to do.
What year are we now?
1991. I think 1991.
Sure.
Dates.
Yeah, close.
Yeah. And so we traveled down there, and the first day that we went down there, they were going to pick him up on a warrant, believe it or not, for having a wife, having 2 wives.
Sure.
Because he was married down there as well.
Surprisingly, not an unheard of thing.
Yeah, no kidding. So, but he was in a different town, and we didn't have him the first day. The second day, they picked him up from his home, brought him to the sheriff's office, told me he was under arrest, and here's a little dinky sheriff's office in this little town, and that's where we interviewed him, was actually in the sheriff's office, right next to the jail. Jail and the sheriff's office had a steel door between it. That's it.
Wait, what's the population of this place where he's living?
It's like maybe 2,000. This is in hillbilly country.
Sure. So you roll in and you effect an arrest on the guy immediately, or how does that work?
They effected an arrest on having the wives, and being a suspect. That night, we were able, with those local investigators, talk about his method and things. So he was a suspect in that homicide down there.
What, do you remember the details?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Because I'll get to that. Yeah, I remember the details. There was a grandmother, another elderly lady. She was in her home. She was strangled. She was sitting there, and he broke in, strangled her, didn't rape her, but strangled her to death, put her in the trunk of a car, drove the vehicle to a bridge where there was a dry creek, then dumped her body off there, then took and parked the car in a bar, a gay bar, parking lot of a gay bar, and that's where it was found. So, and during their investigation, they found out that he drove by there every day. He drove by that house every day, going to work and going home. So twice a day, actually, he drove by that house. When I interviewed him on that, he said, well, I stopped in one time to talk to her, and I ran out of gas, so I needed to use her phone. Oh. So anyhow, we get into the sheriff's office, and as we're walking into the door, we're in the lobby now. Jerry Thyssen says to me, "You're the lead interviewer," and I said, "Oh, okay, Here we go." And I said, "In this interview, in order for me to be really effective and do the things I can do, I need you just to sit there. I just need you to sit there and let me do my thing." So I said, "But I'll turn to you every now and then, if I get stumped." Prior to this, I again contacted the FBI profiling unit. John Douglas is no longer there. I mean, he's there, but he's not handling this case. An agent by the name of Judd Ray was, and I talked to him for quite a while prior to going down there. I said, "How am I going to get this guy to confess?" And he said, "Take your time. It may take up to 4 days to do this."
Wow.
And I went, wow, I don't know if I can interview anybody for 4 days. But I said, all right. And he said, always work the angle of the little girl. He feels really guilty about the little girl. Work that angle. I said, okay.
You know what's funny? I'll interject. Before you think 4 days, and now as the courts have ruled, when we start pressing on that 2 to 4 hour mark, they're going to come hard. A defense attorney is going to use whatever he can, and there's been some over the course of my career that have went, 6, up at all, you're there all day and such. But, the fathom back then, advice would be like, hey, you might be here 4 days with this guy and going. That's times change, whatever, but that's pretty neat. What about this guy? How from Dickinson down to Arkansas? Why? What was the connection there? I mean, is he trying to hide out in this podunk town, I guess, if I'll call it that, or is he?
Yeah, this is where he moved from Dickinson to Michigan. Over in Michigan, he had a boyfriend, and he lived with him for a while, and they must have broke up, and then down to Arkansas he went. Now, during the course of his life, he was a mechanic. He worked for the city of Dickinson at the time of the homicide.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He was a truck driver, over-the-road truck driver, and carnival worker. So he was, he did a lot of different things during his lifetime, and he traveled about. And that was part of the profile, is that he would, he'd try and hide out wherever. So he kind of felt comfortable down there. He had been down there for a while in Arkansas.
Okay.
Anyway, so from there, we walk in to interview him. I sit directly in front of him. Jerry sits off to the side of him, and I start in, and I said, "Do you remember me?" And he said, "Yep. Yeah, I don't remember your name, but I know you're from Dickinson. You're a cop." I said, "Yep." And I said, "You know what we're here for?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Well, we're here to finally take care of business when it comes to the Swanson Motel." "I don't know what you're talking about." And I said, "Well, I need to read you your rights." And I read him his rights. And I said, you really want to talk to us about this? Because well, sure, I'll help out any way I can. So I started talking to him. And what I did, which hadn't been done before, and that the FBI, when I told the FBI, that's why they took a lot of interest in it, I used the profile. I used the 2 pieces of paper, and it was a one page and a half that John Douglas did. And I started reading off everything. I said, well, we got the FBI involved, and here's what they said. You know, this is what you did, and this is who you are. I went through the whole profile. I had highlighted some of the areas I knew would get him, and I highlighted them, and I'd even show it to him. I said, see, this is what the FBI said. So we know you did it. And so, you know, we just want to hear your side of the story before we close this out. And he said, okay. He looks at me, he said, you want me to say I did it? And he holds up his hands like this. He says, I did it. Now, most cops will say, no, I don't want you to tell me what I want to hear. I want you to tell me the truth, or something to that effect. But when he held up his hands like that, I knew through, you know, experience and training, he was giving up. So I said, thank you. Does that not make you feel better? And he went, not yet. I said, well, it will as we go along. And so we got on, you know, this is all recorded. And so we got on tape his version and everything. Now, this man remembered exactly what the little girl was wearing, exactly what Grandma was wearing. He remembered every detail, things that nobody else would have known. And this is 10 years later. And, you know, and so he confessed, and there was no doubt, you know, because of things he remembered. When it came to the part of the sexual assault on the little girl, he would just say, I did things I wish I had never done to her. And this is when Jerry Thyssen would break in and say, well, I need to hear exactly what you did. And he'd look at him and say, I did stuff. Well, what did you do exactly? And he came out and he finally said, I raped a little girl. And I went, okay, you know, so we got it all on tape and we finished it off. And when I was getting up to go out, he said, I want to thank you, Bubba. He called me Bubba. And he said, take boss with you. Because Jerry had pressed him so hard, he called him boss. And so anyway.
That's psychological warfare, you know. There's a lot of different names to it,
sure,
you know, as well. And stuff. But the confession, the art of the confession being like, I did it, that's breadcrumbs, is obviously, you know, I know as it goes along here, those fine details that you referred to there, that's what you really want.
That's right.
You know, on the good confessions.
And you want to ask open questions. You don't, and there's a reason I'm saying that. You just ask open and let them talk to you. You don't lead them into anything. And this one, I was particularly, I'll be honest, I was proud of this interview. It went so well, and it was just the right time and the right things that were being said. It took me an hour and a half, and we were done.
Yeah.
1 hour and a half.
That's graceful. Right?
Yep. So then we go out and, you know, we go to lunch. Jerry and I go to lunch because now the other team is going to go in and get him. And I told him, I said, just walk him through it. I mean, just be very patient. We got our confession. And I was so glad they let us go first. The Arkansas officers went in there and they got somewhat of a confession. And then he stopped talking to them. And he said, I want the Nodak boys back in here. And we went, what? Okay, so so we went back in. They asked us to go back in and do it. As I started interviewing him, it was a whole different flavor. There was a different air about it. He would always say, well, they said I did this. They said I did that. They said, and I went, I don't get this. So right during the interview, it surprised Jerry. I just got up and walked out because I wanted to ask him, what did you tell him? You know, what did you do? Later, we learned how they questioned him was, if you were to use a garden tool to break in through the window or cut the screen, what would you use? Well, Bill, a hole? A hole? No, not a hole. What would you use? A garden. And he goes, a shears? Yeah, a shears. They wrote it down. Yeah. You know, and so they led him through his confession. And that's what caused them the biggest problem. And that's why they didn't keep him. Because they knew, I mean, the state's attorneys between the two states and everything knew we had a solid case. And so we wanted one solid case, and then we'd move on. then we can move on. Well, right after this all happened, and the Arkansas guys let it out that we got a probable serial killer here, everybody in the nation was calling us, calling them particularly, but calling me too. And so they all wanted at it. And so I called Judd Ray from the profiling unit, and I said, I don't think I'm ever going to get him back here. Everybody wants him. And so Judd said, well, I'll put an end to that. He said, we want one conviction, and then we'll walk up and we will walk him through all this stuff. And so that's what the plan was: get a conviction, let the profiling unit come up and interview him. And Texas wanted him for several, Kansas. Those are just some of the states I remember.
Talking about the process, when you're talking about interviewing some people, they probably don't give it the credit it should be given if they've never done it before in the room as such as you're talking. But you and I both, and I've had some bad ones in my own career that I really regret on, but the good ones, when you think about your preparation and your time through, what was that, you talk a little bit about how much of that consumed you?
Oh yeah. Cause you gotta always, for me, interviewing was kind of a natural thing. It was a gift. Again, that's what I'm saying.
That's what the legends say.
Yeah, that's what the legends say. Anyway, it was, the state's attorney said I could get a confession out of a rock. And I went, no, not really. But it's a lot of mental preparation. And when I walked into that room as an interviewer, you were mine. I owned you. And that's how I walked in the room. Now, I wouldn't portray that, but in my head, I owned you. And that takes a while to get used to, and interviewing, as you do it, it becomes more and more natural, and you get better at it. You get really good at it, and it just takes some confidence, and it takes you being able to read the suspect, and get around them. That's what you're doing.
You have to know people.
You have to know people, yeah, and you're asking them to confess to a crime and go to jail. Right. That's not an easy sell. So I think a good car salesman could do it, but who knows? But
how did the criminal justice process play out after that?
Well, they wanted to keep him down there for a while, and there was some bantering back and forth. What really helped our case to get him back here is the state's attorney down there that was prosecuting Bill during this, getting ready. They weren't even getting ready for trial. They were just doing motions and that thing at that time. He called the defense attorney's family. Well, the defense attorney wasn't there. He called him up and said, how could your husband do this? How could he ever defend somebody like this? And just bantered them. And so they got a restraining order on it just got to be a circus. Got a restraining order on the state's attorney, and the judge was, beside himself going, what the heck here? And so that helped us to get him down here, or get him up here. And so extradition, papers were signed, and he traveled up. He got escorted up here.
Yeah. And what about with the family? At this juncture with the family and communication with the family, what's their take on this, reaction to this?
Oh, the reaction was, on the family pretty much was somewhat disbelief. And even years later, I had to meet with family members to go over the case. They wanted to meet they traveled from like Minnesota and Grand Forks area. And I met with them and showed them the entire case because they wanted to know for sure. After that, I think they were pretty satisfied because as Owen Mayer, the state's attorney, said, there was no doubt he did it. Now, the problem they tried to get the confession thrown up. They couldn't do that. They tried to get the trial moved out of Dickinson and couldn't do that. The judge was it was getting set for trial. And the defense attorney was, he tried everything. He was doing a good job. He was court appointed, and he was really active, and he tried every motion he could, and pretty much, he had to, because he knew he didn't have anything. With that confession and with the things that Bill said during that confession, if once that got admitted, it was toast. It was over. I should go back now. When I went in there, just for a second, I'm going to regress. When I went in there, now prior to this, I want you to know we had absolutely any physical evidence against him. I had gone to the state lab and got all the evidence that they had still on file.
How about that fingerprint?
I got that fingerprint, but it didn't match his. Yeah. So I went there and I received the clothing and all that thing, and I said, okay, how can we, get DNA out of here? I know you have DNA, how can we get some DNA? And he said, well, all the evidence on DNA, a freezer broke down and destroyed all the evidence that way. Oh. So we had nothing to go on. So I knew this was a one-shot deal. So that added some pressure.
Oh, for sure.
Okay, so anyhow, we get to the point where we're going to go to trial, and the defense attorney is going to talk with him one more time, and we got a week to go to trial, I believe it was. I get a call in the middle of the night, said, you need to come down here, but you can't go up in the jail. Just come down here. So I went down and I went, what's going on? Here, Bill had passed away in his jail cell on the bed 1 week prior to trial. So that's always left some doubt, in people's mind. But if you ever just listen to the case and listen to that tape and all that, you just know 100% that was the right guy, that we had the right suspect.
And so his legal name was?
William Reager.
William Reager.
He went by Bill.
Did he have priors to the incident at Swanson?
I don't recall. Okay. I don't recall. If he did, they were minor. They were minor charges. There was nothing major.
Here's some perspective for you when you think about no physical evidence and working with information at that time and using what you had. Like now, if we were to send out our team of investigators to process that scene, I mean, some of the things at hand between our reverse cell phone tower stuff to triangulate who's there. We have a geofence capability now where essentially we would pinpoint coordinates around that and find out who was all there at that said time that we believed it occurred. And then you pair that up with some DNA and some of those advances, right? That, I mean, some of them you're familiar with even during the course of your career.
Yes.
That change the game in that way. It's, I don't know, has that been something you think about that? I mean, what are your thoughts when you hear some of that stuff?
If we would have had half the technology you guys have today, that thing would have been solved probably that day, Yeah. But yeah, we just didn't have anything to work with. The biggest thing that as a department we overcame was the lack of training. From then on, I believe there was such a focus on training and such a demand for it. Because we were caught flat-footed, and as an investigator, and I had this under my belt. Of course, I was able to attend the FBI Academy, which I learned so much more there. I attended a week-long homicide school, and this was put on by a retired lieutenant out of the Bronx in New York, and he handled over 1,000 homicides. And the one thing he did that I'll never forget is. He said, I'm here to not only teach you some techniques, but I'm here to make sure that when you see that body, you see it as evidence and not freak out and see it as a person. This is evidence. And so he said, I'm going to expose you to the worst of the worst that I had to deal with. Wow. I'm telling you, what humans can do to other humans is right. Unbelievable. Yeah. Unbelievable.
Yeah, an unfortunate part that, in the room here, that's the side of it that many of the folks that we deal with don't get to see, and I'm glad they don't get to see that stuff and pay us to do that. But man, Chief, you got any thoughts on any of that?
That was just intriguing listening to that coming from your mouth, Chief. That was, we read about it until you actually hear it from somebody that worked that case. It definitely tells a story. Thank you for sharing that.